I didn't know my marriage had already ended the night my husband refused to help me pay my hospital bill. I remember staring at the white ceiling tiles, the smell of antiseptic burning my nose, my left leg suspended in a metal frame. The doctor had just explained that I had 4 broken ribs, internal bleeding, and a fractured femur that required surgery. My body felt like it had been dismantled and put back together incorrectly. But the worst pain didn't come from the accident. It came from the phone call. "Can you transfer the money from the emergency account?" I asked my husband, Laney. My voice was weak, dry. "That's what it's for. It's an emergency." There was silence. Then he said calmly, "That money isn't for this." I thought I had misheard him. "For what?" I whispered. "For me," he said. "It's my security." I stared at the wall. The heart monitor beeped steadily, like it didn't understand the gravity of what had just happened. "Laney," I said slowly, "I was hit by a car. I need surgery." He sighed like I was being dramatic. "You're exaggerating," he replied. "I'm not letting you manipulate me." Then he hung up. 3 days later, I found out he had withdrawn every dollar from that account, more than $10,000, and used it as a down payment on a luxury SUV for his mother. That was the moment I realized something terrifying. I had not married a partner. I had married someone who saw me as a bank account. And the story of how I got there started long before that hospital room. My name is Lena. I was 25 when I met Laney, and 31 when I finally signed the divorce papers that made me feel like I could breathe again. People assume I was naive, or desperate, or blinded by love. The truth is uglier. I was starved for belonging. I grew up without parents. They died in a house fire when I was 7. I don't remember the flames clearly, just the smell, and the way the adults spoke in soft voices around me like I was made of glass. After that, I went to live with my Aunt Elena, my mother's older sister. She wasn't rich. She wasn't even comfortable. She was a retired school teacher, living on a pension in a quiet 2-bedroom house in the suburbs. But she was steady. She packed my lunch. She checked my homework. She went to parent-teacher meetings alone, sitting in those tiny classroom chairs with her back straight and her hands folded, like she was daring life to take anything else from us. And because she gave me stability, I developed a kind of gratitude that turned into pressure. I didn't want to just survive. I wanted to become someone who deserved what she sacrificed. So I worked. I studied engineering in college and treated it like a job. Most weekends, I was either at the library or working part-time at a grocery store, stocking shelves, ringing up families, buying snacks, watching normal life pass me by through fluorescent lights. I didn't go to parties. I didn't date much. I didn't even know how to. I told myself that once I graduated, once I got a real salary, then I'd have time for love. But love doesn't wait for your schedule. I met Laney during my junior year at a campus coffee shop. I was sitting alone with my laptop open, reviewing for an exam, half a muffin untouched beside me. I remember because I was counting calories back then. Poor habits from trying to control something in my life when so much had been uncontrollable. Laney walked up holding a drink and said, smiling, "Is this seat taken? Everywhere else is full." He didn't ask like he expected permission. He asked like he already belonged there. I looked around. The place was crowded, buzzing with conversations and espresso machines. I nodded. "Sure." He sat down and glanced at my notes. "Engineering?" "Yeah," he whistled. "That's intense. I could never." He said it with admiration, not mockery. That mattered to me. He introduced himself, Laney, and told me he was studying communications. He asked questions. He laughed at my nervous little jokes. He acted like I was interesting, even though I felt like a person made entirely of deadlines and caution. A few weeks later, he asked me out, and I said yes because nobody had ever made me feel chosen that confidently before. The first few months were fine. We went to cheap restaurants, shared appetizers, watched movies at the Dollar Theater. He'd lean into me in the dark and whisper sarcastic commentary that made me laugh. I remember thinking, this is what normal people get to have. This is what I earned. But then small things started shifting. At first it was subtle. Laney forgot his wallet. Once, twice. Then 5 or 6 times. We'd be standing at the counter, the cashier waiting, and he'd pat his pockets dramatically. "Oh my God, I left it at home." The first time, I smiled and paid. The second time, I teased him gently. By the 5th time, I stopped commenting altogether and just slid my card forward, my face warm with embarrassment, even though I was the one paying. Then came the excuses. "I can't work this semester," he said one night while scrolling on his phone. "My classes are really demanding." I looked at him over my ramen. "I'm taking 18 credits. "That's different," he replied, without looking up. "Your brain is built for that." He made it sound like a compliment. but something in me tightened anyway. Then he started pulling me into his social life. "Come to this party with me," he insisted. "I want you there." And I'd go, even though loud rooms made me feel like I couldn't breathe, because I thought this is what girlfriends do. But every time we arrived, Laney would disappear. He'd vanish into other rooms with his friends, leaving me alone near the wall with a soda because I didn't drink. I'd smile politely at strangers. I'd watch him laugh with people who didn't even know my name. When I finally confronted him, he brushed it off. "I just get caught up," he said, "but I need you there." "For what?" I asked. He smiled like I should already understand. "To drive me home. To make sure I'm safe." It sounded like responsibility, like trust, but it felt like being used. The first time I couldn't go because I had a major exam the next morning, he called me 17 times. 17. At 2 a.m., I woke up to my phone buzzing like an alarm. I answered, half asleep, my throat raw. "Laney, what's wrong?" He was screaming. "You don't care about my safety," he shouted. "You're probably out with someone else." I sat up, my heart pounding. "What? I'm asleep. I have an exam." "Liar," he spit. "You don't answer because you're hiding something." I remember staring at the darkness of my room, my textbooks open on my desk like silent witnesses, thinking, how did we get here? And that became the pattern. If I didn't answer within 3 rings, I was cheating. If I didn't text back fast enough, I was suspicious. He started showing up at my apartment unannounced, claiming he missed me, but his eyes would scan the room like he was searching for evidence. He went through my phone, twice that I know of. The first time I caught him, he was sitting on my bed, my phone in his hand, scrolling with a calm expression that didn't match what he was doing. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice thin. He didn't even flinch. "Relax. If you have nothing to hide, why are you upset?" I should have left then, but I didn't. Because when you grow up losing people, your brain confuses control with care. After graduation, I got hired at a consulting firm. The salary was good, $70,000 a year, which felt unreal for someone who used to count pennies at the grocery store. I took my Aunt Elena out to dinner to celebrate. She cried, she squeezed my hand and said she was proud. Laney celebrated too, but not by getting a job. He said he was looking, but nothing felt right. He wanted something meaningful, something aligned, something that didn't drain his energy. And somehow I let that become normal. Then his mother entered the picture more aggressively. Hannah, his mom, was 55, always dressed like she'd stepped out of a church newsletter. Pearls, pressed blouse, perfume that lingered too long. She started coming around more often, sitting at my kitchen table like she owned the place. She had a habit of smiling while she criticized. One Sunday after church, because yes, they went every Sunday and I sometimes went just to keep the peace, Hannah pulled me aside in the parking lot. Her hand rested on my arm, light but possessive. "Lena," she said softly, "you two are living together without being married. That doesn't look good." I swallowed. "We're adults." She nodded like she was humoring a child. "And Laney is getting older." Laney was 23. I was 25. But Hannah said it like his fertility was expiring. "If you love him," she continued, "you'll make it official." After that conversation, Laney started bringing up marriage constantly. He showed me pictures of rings he liked. He sent me links to wedding venues. He talked about his friends getting engaged and how he felt left behind. I remember sitting in my Aunt Elena's kitchen, telling her all of it while she stirred soup on the stove. "I think I should propose," I said, trying to sound confident. Elena didn't answer right away. She just listened. Then she turned off the burner and looked at me fully. "Does Laney make you happy?" she asked. "Yes," I replied automatically, like a reflex. She held my gaze longer than I was comfortable with. "Does he make you happy?" she asked again. This time I couldn't answer. Elena's face softened, not angry, not judgmental, just sad in a quiet, careful way. "You should trust your gut," she said gently. "But whatever you decide, I'll support you." Then she went to her bedroom and returned with a small box. Inside was her mother's ring, my grandmother's ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond. Nothing flashy, but heavy with history. She placed it in my palm like she was passing me both love and warning at the same time. "I'm giving you this," she said, "not because I approve of Laney." My throat tightened. "But because it belongs to our family," she continued, "and you should have it." 3 months later, I proposed. I rented out a section of a botanical garden. I hired a photographer because Laney wanted a moment worth posting. It cost almost $4,000. I wore a dress I thought looked romantic and adult. My hand shook so badly I could barely open the ring box. When I got down on one knee, Laney's face lit up, then flickered. Just for a second. His eyes dropped to the ring and something sharp crossed his expression. Not disappointment exactly, more like calculation. Then he laughed, squealed, said yes, and hugged me like I'd just given him a prize. That night, he took 50 photos of the ring and posted all of them. And I told myself it was just excitement. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself this is what love looks like when it finally chooses you. I didn't realize I was already signing up to be someone's provider and their scapegoat. The signs were small at first, just little things I brushed off because I wanted so desperately to believe in the future I was building with Lainey. But the cracks started to show, and looking back now, they're so obvious it's almost laughable. Lainey had always been demanding. I didn't see it as a problem then. I thought it was just his way of wanting attention, wanting to be cared for in a world that seemed too cold for him. I loved him, so I thought maybe I could help him feel like he was enough. But after we got engaged, I started feeling exhausted. At first, it was the small, unreasonable requests. He wanted a bigger apartment, even though we had just signed a lease on a modest place that fit both of us just fine. It's not about space, he'd say. It's about the kind of life we deserve. But I didn't want to stretch our budget. I didn't want to take on more debt when we were already struggling to save for the wedding. Still, I did it. I found a larger apartment, and we moved in a few months later. But it was more than just space. It was the constant reminder that I was the one keeping the financial wheels turning. Lainey stopped talking about getting a job. He said it was hard to balance the wedding planning with looking for work. And he was right about one thing. Planning a wedding was a full-time job. His mom, Hannah, took over most of the logistics. I couldn't count the number of evenings I spent looking at different venues, flowers, and caterers without once being asked for my opinion. But when the bills came in, the responsibility was always mine. The wedding was becoming an event neither of us could afford. The venue, the flowers, the photographer, they were all things Lainey insisted on. He said it would be worth it, that it would be the best day of our lives. I worked overtime, sometimes 60 hours a week, just to keep up. I paid for the engagement ring, the venue, the catering, the photographers. I paid for it all. Lainey didn't contribute a dime. He said he wanted to be sure everything was perfect. Then there were the little manipulations that started to feel like patterns. A week before the wedding, Lainey dropped the bombshell that my aunt and cousins wouldn't be invited. I was shocked. My aunt, Elena, who had helped raise me after my parents passed, was being excluded from the event. "I don't see why we need to invite everyone from your family," Lainey said, his voice icy as he flipped through the wedding guest list. "My side of the family is bigger. It's just not going to work with the space." I argued, pointing out that we were paying for a venue that could hold 200 people, and my family only had about 80 members. It made no sense, but Lainey's mom, Hannah, got involved. She pulled me aside one day after church and said, "Lena, we've been to your family gatherings. They can be a bit much. Don't you want your day to be special?" The pressure was suffocating. I called my Aunt Elena, my voice shaking. "I don't think you're invited to the wedding." She didn't say much. She just listened. But I could feel the disappointment in her silence. The next day, I stood my ground. "If my family can't come, then there will be no wedding." Lainey cried. Hannah called me selfish. The drama felt endless. But I wasn't going to back down. I stood firm, and finally, Lainey relented, but we didn't speak for 3 days after that. I felt hollow inside, like I was constantly fighting for something that should have been simple: love and respect. The day of the wedding came, and the tension in the air was so thick I could barely breathe. When we arrived at the venue, Lainey and his family barely acknowledged my aunt. My aunt, who had loved me like a mother. They seated her at a table in the back, near the bathrooms, where it felt like an afterthought. The entire reception, Lainey barely interacted with me. His attention was solely on his family. We didn't take a single photo together, not one, and my aunt, Elena, was barely mentioned. She left early, hugging me tightly and whispering, "I love you," before she slipped out of the venue. And the worst part? Lainey didn't seem to care. He didn't care that my aunt felt unimportant. He didn't care that this was the one day we were supposed to celebrate our love, and instead I felt like a background character in my own wedding. He was already lost to me, but I didn't want to admit it. Not yet. The marriage didn't last long after that. In the first year, Lainey refused to get a job. He spent his days playing video games while I worked and paid the bills. He asked for an allowance. An allowance. I was making good money, but I wasn't rich, and yet he started demanding more. At first, I thought it was because he was insecure, but the longer it went on, the more it felt like he was just taking. The more he took, the less I had. And that's when things began to unravel. The breaking point came just after my accident. I'd been driving home from work on a rainy night when someone ran a red light and slammed into my car. The world had shifted in an instant. 1 second, I was holding the wheel. The next, everything went black. I woke up 3 days later in the hospital, my body broken and bruised, my mind a muddled mess of confusion. I had a fractured femur, 4 broken ribs, and internal bleeding. It took me a few minutes to even recognize where I was, but when the nurse entered the room and gave me a quick update on my condition, my heart sank. I needed surgery, $18,000 worth of surgery. The insurance covered most of it, but there was still a $15,000 balance that I needed to pay before I could be discharged. The weight of that amount felt like a physical pressure on my chest. I needed help. I called Laney, my husband. It was supposed to be a straightforward conversation. All I needed was for him to access the emergency savings account we had set up together for situations like this. The account was there specifically for moments like mine. It was a safety net for the unexpected, for when life threw its worst at us. But when I asked him to help, something strange happened. "I need the money," I said, my voice weak. "The hospital says I can't leave without it." His answer came slowly, like it was carefully considered. "No," he said flatly. "That money isn't for this." I thought I hadn't heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" My breath hitched in my throat. "This is exactly what the emergency fund is for. Please, I can't afford this. I'm in the hospital, Laney." "I'm not going to let you manipulate me into giving up my money," he said, his tone cold, distant. "That account is for me, not you." I felt the air leave my lungs. My mind raced. "Laney, this is an emergency. This is exactly why we set it up. I'm not asking for anything beyond what we planned." But his voice grew firmer. "No, Lena, I won't. It's not happening." And then he hung up. I didn't know what to do. The words, "it's not happening," echoed in my mind, over and over again, drowning out everything else. I couldn't understand it. He was my husband. I had always been there for him, supported him, paid for his dreams, his whims, his family's needs. I thought we were a partnership, but suddenly I felt alone in this hospital bed, alone in my pain, alone in this marriage. The next morning, my best friend Chris came to visit me. He didn't say much at first, just sat with me, letting the silence speak for itself. After an hour, I told him what happened, how Laney had refused to help me, even though that money was for exactly this situation. Chris didn't say anything at first, just stared at me for a moment. His eyes were calm, but full of something darker. He stood up without a word and left the room. When he came back an hour later, he held a check in his hand. "Here," he said quietly. "It's for the hospital bill. You'll pay me back when you can. No rush. No interest." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and whispered, "Thank you." I couldn't fathom what had just happened. Here was a man who had watched me go through the motions of my life, giving, sacrificing, and he was offering me help without a second thought, without hesitation, without judgment. Meanwhile, my husband refused to help me when I needed him most. It didn't make sense. It wasn't long after that I realized something that had been brewing in me for a while. Laney was never going to change. I had always told myself that marriage required sacrifice, that love was about giving and taking. But this, what Laney had just done, was beyond selfish. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, about who held the power and who was left to beg for it. When I finally got home from the hospital, everything in the house was a mess. The dishes piled up in the sink. The laundry was scattered everywhere. I was on crutches, unable to move much. I couldn't even clean up after myself. It felt like a slap in the face. I took a seat on the couch and opened my phone. That's when I saw it. Laney had posted photos that morning. He was standing next to his mother, Hannah, smiling in front of a brand new, shiny, luxury SUV. The caption, "Finally got mom her dream car. She deserves it. #blessed, #family love." I opened my bank app. The security account, my emergency fund, was empty. All of it. Every last dollar was gone. I felt the blood drain from my face. Laney had taken all of it, every single penny, without hesitation, without even asking, without a thought to my hospital bills, to the pain I was going through. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I called a lawyer the next day. I didn't tell Laney. I didn't tell him I was preparing for a divorce. I started organizing documents, bank statements, screenshots of social media posts about the car, receipts for every single penny I had spent during our marriage. And that was when the final step came. I filed for divorce. I had the papers delivered while I was still in the house. Laney came home that day. The papers were sitting on the kitchen table. He saw them and just laughed. "I knew you'd do this," he sneered. "You're bluffing. You always bluff." I didn't say anything. I just sat there, the weight of everything hitting me all at once as he picked up a plate and smashed it against the wall in a burst of rage. Then another, and another. I couldn't move. I just sat there in shock as he broke everything in sight. Finally, he picked up one of my aunt's old photo albums and threw it on the floor, stomping on it. The photos of me as a child. Our family. That was when I snapped. I called the police. And after that, I was done. I would never beg for someone who couldn't even see me, let alone love me. I thought in that moment, when the police arrived, when I was sitting there in the wreckage of my life, that I would feel anger, maybe even relief. But all I felt was numb. It was like my emotions had been stripped away, layer by layer, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. I watched as the officers arrested Laney, his screams echoing through the house, the rage in his voice a stark contrast to the cold, controlled fury I had inside. I didn't feel any satisfaction as they handcuffed him and led him away. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt empty. That was the moment I realized I had been living in a lie. I had given everything, my time, my money, my heart, to a man who was incapable of truly seeing me. All the while he had used me, manipulated me, and drained me dry. And I had let it happen because I was afraid of being alone, of not being enough. I was terrified of losing the idea of family. But now, in the silence that followed, I couldn't help but wonder, had I ever really known him? When the officers left, I was left standing in the same house, staring at the broken plates, the shards of our life scattered across the floor. The walls seemed to close in around me, the weight of the situation pressing down on my chest. My marriage was over. The pain in my leg from the accident flared up as I moved toward the couch, and I sat there, my heart pounding in my ears. The adrenaline was wearing off, and I could feel the full force of the emotional exhaustion creeping up on me. I started to question everything. Had I ignored the warning signs? I thought about how I had pushed my own needs aside for so long, how I had accepted his excuses, his failures, and his betrayals, always telling myself that love required sacrifice. But sacrifice was supposed to be mutual, and this was nothing more than a one-way street. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty house, feeling like I didn't know who I was anymore. But then something shifted inside me. I was done. Done with feeling guilty for not being enough. Done with trying to fix a relationship that had been broken long before it even started. I didn't need Laney to validate my worth. I didn't need his approval, his money, or his love. I needed to take back control. I had always been the one to keep things together, to hold the pieces of my life in place when everything else was falling apart. But this time, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could change how I moved forward. The divorce was filed, the papers were served, and the process began. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was accepting that I was allowed to be angry, that it was okay to be furious with the man I had loved, the man I had invested everything in, who had shattered me with his selfishness. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to get it all out, but instead I just sat there, breathing, steadying myself. I had to find my footing again. The next few days felt like a blur. Phone calls to the lawyer, collecting all the evidence I could, getting my things together. And then there was the call from Hannah, Laney's mother. I wasn't prepared for it. It came just after the police left, and I was sitting on the couch, trying to process what had just happened. The moment I saw her name on the caller ID, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I answered it on the third ring. "Lena," she said, her voice soft but filled with an undercurrent of tension. "I know this has been hard on everyone, but you need to stop this. It's not too late to fix things. Laney is going through a lot right now. He didn't mean to hurt you." I felt my chest tighten. This was it. She was trying to make me feel guilty, trying to convince me that I was the one who had caused this. "No," I said firmly, my voice almost a whisper. "This has been a long time coming. You're not going to make me feel guilty for finally standing up for myself." "I just think you should reconsider," she continued, her tone taking on a pleading edge. "Laney is sorry, Lena. He wants to fix things." I swallowed, holding my ground. "He's not sorry. He's sorry that he got caught. I'm done, Hannah. I'm not going back." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I knew she was trying to find the right words, but I didn't give her the chance. "I'm not asking for your approval," I added, "and I'm not asking for him to change. I'm asking for peace, and that means moving on." The conversation ended with her begging me to reconsider, but I already knew what I had to do. Laney was not my responsibility anymore. I wasn't his caretaker. I wasn't his safety net. I had been trying to carry him for so long, but now it was time for me to carry myself. I started to make plans. I contacted a friend who had a spare room available. I packed my things, leaving behind everything that reminded me of a future that would never be. I wouldn't let Lainey or anyone else rob me of my dignity again. The next chapter of my life was going to be mine, and I would fight for it. The first few days after Lainey's arrest felt like a blur. I stayed at a friend's place, using the time to get some space, to breathe. It was quiet there, peaceful. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of a looming argument or a back and forth about who was right or wrong. But the silence wasn't just calming, it was unsettling. I still had to face the reality of what I'd done, what I had allowed. And though I knew that filing for divorce was the right thing to do, it still felt like a betrayal. I couldn't shake the nagging doubt. Had I given up too easily? But then I remembered the phone call from Hannah, Lainey's mother. She was relentless. A few days after I told her I was done, she called again. And again. She left voicemails, sent text, even emailed me. She was desperate, but in a way that felt more like manipulation than concern. "Hannah, I'm not going to change my mind," I said, my voice tight as I answered the phone one afternoon. "This is done." Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Lena, you don't understand. Lainey is in a fragile state right now. He's hurting. He's sorry for everything, and he wants to make amends. You owe it to yourself and to him to fix things." I felt a wave of frustration flood my chest. How many times had I heard those words? "I'm sorry. I'll change." It was a never-ending cycle. "I don't owe him anything, Hannah," I said, my grip on the phone tightening. "I'm done." "I think you're making a mistake," she said softly, but I could hear the steel beneath her words. "I know what this marriage meant to you. You don't just walk away from that." Her words hit harder than I expected, slicing through my resolve. She was right. I did want to walk away, but it was so much harder than I thought. "Look," I said, trying to steady my breath, "I know you want to protect your son, but I have to do what's right for me. Lainey's choices have consequences, and I'm not the one who's going to bear them." The conversation ended with her telling me to think it over again, but I didn't need to think anymore. I had made my decision. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The next week, things escalated in a way I hadn't anticipated. Lainey's family wasn't the only one who was trying to drag me back into the chaos. He was still trying to manipulate me, even from behind bars. Every few days, I'd get a letter from him, his handwriting shaky and desperate. In one, he begged for forgiveness, said he was going to therapy, said that he had changed. I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I was angry, but because I had realized something painful. I had no obligation to carry his emotional burden anymore. The more I ignored him, the more his actions started to get extreme. It was Hannah who came up with the final card to play. One morning, I woke up to an email from her. Subject line, "We can fix this." It was long, pleading. The email talked about family, about healing, about giving Lainey a second chance. It claimed that he had reached out to her, crying, begging her for help. She wrote about how much he was struggling and how I was his only hope of redemption. But here's where it crossed the line. She suggested that I could help by forgiving him and allowing him back into my life. That's when I snapped. I blocked her number. I deleted the emails. I didn't care about the apologies, the letters, or the sob stories anymore. I was done with the barrage of guilt. I realized just how deeply Lainey and his family had worn me down, to the point where I was starting to question my own decisions. Was I too harsh? Was I too cold? But no, the truth was, I had been too forgiving, too patient, and I was tired of letting people walk all over me. The real test came when Lainey's lawyer called me. It was 2 weeks after the initial filing, and the lawyer was demanding that I drop the charges and settle this amicably. He said that Lainey was willing to offer me a large sum of money to end the divorce quietly, to avoid public humiliation. I froze when I heard the words. I had no interest in money. I had no interest in anything he could offer, but his voice, his tone, the way he tried to twist the situation into something that wasn't my fault, was a slap in the face. I told him exactly what I thought. This isn't about money. This is about my peace. It's over, and nothing you say or do will change that. I hung up before he could say anything else. That same week, the tension between Lainey's family and mine grew more intense. Hannah started showing up uninvited to my apartment, sending me gifts wrapped in expensive paper. There were flowers. Too many flowers. They arrived almost daily. I didn't want anything from them. I didn't want their pity. And then, one evening, as I was leaving work, I spotted Lainey standing outside my building. He was waiting there, pale, desperate, his eyes wide with that familiar look of manipulation. I wanted to run, but I stood my ground. "I've tried to leave you alone," I said, voice trembling but firm. "Why can't you just let me go?" He stepped closer, and my heart raced. "I can't," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I love you, Lena. Please don't do this." I could feel his presence closing in, feel the weight of the years of resentment and manipulation bearing down on me. But instead of stepping back, I took one step forward. I looked him directly in the eyes. "I don't love you anymore," I said, voice low but strong. "You've taken everything from me, and I'm done." For the first time in years, I saw the true Laney, the man who had made me feel small, who had used me, manipulated me, and never once considered my well-being. I didn't need to team anything more. I turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest, but my mind clearer than it had ever been. I was finally free. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a fog, heavy, suffocating, and disorienting. I had thought that once I took control, once I filed for divorce and made the decision to leave Laney behind, it would feel like a weight had lifted off me, that I'd feel free. But it didn't happen like that. Instead, I found myself spiraling into a place I hadn't expected: loneliness. The first few nights after the police took Laney away, I spent hours staring at the walls in my empty apartment. It should have been a place of refuge, a place where I could heal. But all I felt was the silence that filled the space between the corners of my life, the echoes of a relationship that had consumed everything: my energy, my hopes, my self-worth. I had spent so long giving, so long believing that if I kept pushing, kept sacrificing, I would be rewarded. But now, standing in the wreckage, I couldn't help but feel like I had nothing left to offer, nothing left of me. At times, it felt like I was fading into the shadows of my own existence. I had always prided myself on being strong, resilient. But now that the pressure was off, now that the chaos of my marriage was over, I realized I didn't know who I was anymore. I felt empty, lost. No one had prepared me for this kind of emptiness. One evening, after another long day of paperwork and meetings with my lawyer, I sat on my couch, a glass of wine in hand, staring at the flickering light of the TV that I wasn't even watching. I could feel the sharp, familiar ache in my chest, the ache that came from being betrayed, from realizing how deeply I had been used. That night, I didn't know what I needed. I didn't know if I wanted to cry, scream, or disappear completely. I called Chris, my best friend, the one person who had been there for me through the darkest parts of my marriage. But even his voice over the phone felt distant, like something I could never truly grasp. "Hey, it's me," I said, my voice sounding like someone else's. "I don't know what's happening to me, Chris. I don't know how to keep going." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Lena," Chris finally said, his voice firm but gentle, "you're going through hell right now, but you can't keep letting this define you. You're more than what Laney did to you." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But in that moment, I just felt so small, like I was walking through life, but the world around me kept getting bigger, and I kept getting smaller. "I don't even know who I am anymore," I whispered. "I don't recognize the person I've become." Chris was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, he said something that struck me like a lightning bolt. "You are not Laney's wife anymore. You are Lena, and you're allowed to feel everything. But you can't let him take this from you, too. You've already lost so much, but you've still got yourself." I spent the next few days in introspection, trying to dig through the emotional wreckage. I visited a therapist, someone I'd never considered before, but she helped me untangle the mess that had become my life. It wasn't easy. It was painful and raw. I cried more in those sessions than I had in the years I'd spent with Laney, but I needed to. I needed to release the years of bottled-up frustration, sadness, and resentment. The woman who walked into the therapist's office was not the same one who walked out. I was still raw, still broken in so many ways, but I wasn't lost anymore. I was starting to find myself piece by piece. But even as I worked through the pain, the reality of the situation continued to haunt me. Laney was still out there. He was still trying to get to me, even though we were legally separated. There were more phone calls, more texts, more letters. Each one felt like an invasion of the peace I was slowly starting to build. I could almost hear his voice in the background of my thoughts, the same voice that had once whispered promises of forever. But now, that voice was only a reminder of the empty shell he had left me with. It was the final text from him that broke through my hard-earned resolve. It was short, simple, but packed with something dangerous. "I still love you, Lena. I'll always love you." The words hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over everything I had worked so hard to rebuild. I sat in the middle of my living room staring at that screen, the words blurring before my eyes. He still loved me? It was like a sick joke. How could he love me when he had treated me so badly? When he had drained me emotionally, financially, and mentally? When he had stolen everything and given nothing in return? I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my phone across the room. But instead, I did the only thing that made sense. I hit block. And as I did, a small piece of my fear lifted. I was finally free. It wasn't the kind of freedom I had imagined. It wasn't the victory I had dreamed of. But it was enough for now. Enough to begin again. The loneliness didn't go away immediately. It still felt like a weight on my chest. But with every step I took away from Lainey, I felt like I was reclaiming pieces of myself I had given up over the years. And maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild a life that was truly mine. Weeks passed, and with each one, the space between me and the chaos of my past grew just a little bit wider. But even in the quiet, even in the moments where I found myself breathing a little easier, there were still flashbacks, snippets of the marriage I had tried so desperately to make work, the times I had ignored my own needs, the times I had silenced my own instincts, all for the sake of keeping the peace. It all felt like a sick joke, a betrayal of who I was meant to be. But that wasn't my reality anymore. I had to remind myself of that daily. I had started to go out again. Nothing big, just small things, like grabbing coffee on a Saturday morning or walking through the local park. I'd forgotten what it felt like to do things for myself. It felt strange at first, like I was pretending to be someone else. But then, slowly, I began to realize something. I was allowed to exist outside of Lainey's world. One evening, a few months after the divorce was finalized, I sat down with Chris over dinner. It was a quiet evening, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't about the past. It wasn't about the hurt, the betrayal, or the pain. It was just me, sitting across from someone who knew my soul. Chris looked at me, and I saw the familiarity in his eyes. He could read me better than anyone. "Lena," he said, his voice gentle, "you've come so far. I'm proud of you." I smiled weakly. I'm just still figuring things out. Chris nodded, taking a sip of his wine before setting it down. "You know, you don't have to figure everything out on your own, and you certainly don't have to let Lainey, or anyone else, dictate what your happiness looks like." I shook my head, the weight of everything beginning to settle into my chest again. "I'm trying, Chris, but it's harder than I thought. I still feel like there are pieces of me I haven't found yet, like I'm just existing." "You've been existing for far too long," he said with conviction. "You've been living for someone else, someone who didn't deserve you. Now it's time to live for you. You get to define what happiness looks like." I didn't answer right away. I just sat there, taking in his words, feeling them reverberate through me. He was right, in a way. I had spent so many years trying to be the person he wanted me to be, trying to fit into a life that wasn't mine. But it was time to create my own. A few weeks later, I found myself sitting in a quiet coffee shop, a place I used to go to with Lainey. Back then, it had felt like part of our routine, another place where I could sacrifice my time and energy to make sure he was happy. But now it felt different. It felt like me. I opened my laptop, the blank screen staring back at me. For the first time, I didn't feel the pressure of needing to write something for someone else. No, this was for me. I started typing. At first, it was just thoughts, fragments of what had happened, reflections on the past. But as I typed, the words began to form something more substantial. I wasn't just writing about the pain anymore. I was writing about healing, about learning to love myself again. I was writing about new beginnings. And I realized in that moment, I was finally ready. But there was one thing I still had to face, the question I had been avoiding. What would I do with Lainey? For the longest time, I had held on to a part of him, the part where I still loved him, where I still hoped he might change, where I still wanted to believe in a future that included him. But I had spent enough of my life clinging to things that were broken, things that could never be fixed. I needed to let him go. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It wasn't about understanding or closure. It was about letting him stay in the past, where he belonged, and moving forward into a future that was mine. A few days later, I received a final letter from Lainey. It was short, almost detached, and I couldn't tell if it was his attempt at closure or a final plea for control. In it, he apologized again, begged me to reconsider, and promised that he had changed. I read the letter, but I didn't feel the pain that used to accompany his words. Instead, I felt numb. I realized that I had already said everything I needed to say to him. I had already let him go. The letter was just one last tether, one final attempt to pull me back into his orbit. but I was done. I burned it. I was standing on this precipice of something new, and I knew that for the first time in years, the only thing that truly mattered was me. The world felt like it was opening up again, and I could see a future that didn't have to be tied to him. It was mine to create. I would find joy again. I would find myself again. And I would be whole. The weeks following, the moment I burned Lainey's letter, were quieter than I expected. It wasn't a loud, dramatic closing chapter. It wasn't an explosive ending. Instead, it was a series of small, peaceful moments where I reclaimed my life. But peace can be a strange thing. The silence wasn't a balm. It was a reminder. Every morning I woke up, I was reminded that I had made a choice to leave behind years of self-doubt, manipulation, and resentment. That choice had been hard to make, but it was also the only thing that could allow me to move forward. Yet the fallout was inevitable. Laney wasn't going to disappear quietly. His presence lingered like a shadow, always just out of reach, but never entirely gone. It started with the social media posts, the rants, the accusations. Laney went public with our divorce in a way that made me feel like I was living under a microscope. I'd been prepared for it. He had always thrived in the spotlight, always needed to be seen and admired. But this was different. This wasn't about him seeking attention. This was about him trying to rewrite the story of our marriage. His posts painted me as the villain. He called me controlling, manipulative, and claimed that I was the one who had destroyed everything. He twisted the truth into something unrecognizable, making it sound like I was the one who had walked away from everything, like I was the one who had abandoned our vows. It didn't matter that he had been the one who had emptied the emergency fund for his mother's car. It didn't matter that he had broken my trust in every way possible. He was spinning the narrative, and it hurt. It hurt more than I'd like to admit. I wanted to scream. I wanted to defend myself. But instead, I did something that shocked me. I stayed quiet. I didn't respond. I didn't retaliate. I didn't let his words pull me back into the chaos. The truth, after all, had already been laid bare. My friends, my family, my lawyer, all of them knew the truth. It was his reputation that would fall apart. But even in the midst of his attempts to ruin me, I couldn't help but feel the sting. The emotional cost of everything he had done to me was still there, hidden just beneath the surface. I still had moments when I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, thinking about everything he had taken from me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about everything that had been lost in that marriage. Trust, respect, a future. But with each passing day, I started to realize something. I wasn't the one who had destroyed it all. He had, and the world was starting to see that. A few months later, the fallout reached its final, undeniable conclusion. Laney's social media accounts were deleted. His friends disappeared. The narrative he had spun fell apart because it had no legs to stand on. People saw him for what he really was, a man who had used his marriage as a way to hide from his own insecurities and failures. He wasn't the victim. He wasn't the good guy. He had failed me, and now the truth was out there for everyone to see. And it didn't matter how many apologies he posted online or how many desperate phone calls he made to me. There was nothing left for him to take. It wasn't until the final court hearing that the weight of it all hit me. Fully. I stood in the courtroom, my lawyer at my side, as the judge handed down his decision. Laney was denied any alimony. He tried to argue that the security account was a gift, but the evidence was clear. That account was marital property, and every penny of it was mine. The house was mine. I had won. I remember walking out of the courthouse, feeling like I had just crossed a finish line. It wasn't a win I had hoped for. It wasn't one that came with joy or celebration. It came with the relief of knowing that I was finally free. Laney was left with his pride and his shattered reputation. And I was left with the pieces of my own life that I would finally get to rebuild. In the months that followed, the pieces of my life started falling into place. Slowly, yes, but steadily. I found a new job, a promotion at the consulting firm I'd been working at for years. It was a step up, a chance to prove to myself that I wasn't just defined by my past. I was capable of more, and the work was hard, but rewarding. I began to take up hobbies I had neglected. I started running again. I reconnected with friends. I even began writing, something I had always wanted to do, but never had the time for. I started telling my story. Not the one Laney wanted me to tell, but the one I had been too afraid to admit to myself. And I began dating again, though tentatively. Elena, the woman I had met months after the divorce, was still a big part of my life. Her steady support and gentle encouragement helped me realize I wasn't alone. I could build a future, a future that was mine. But despite all the progress, there were still days when I found myself sitting in silence, staring out the window, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. And then I'd remember something Chris told me, something that stuck with me. You've learned the hardest lesson of all, Lena. You've learned that you're enough, and no one can take that from you. And he was right. I didn't need Laney. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need his validation. I was enough. And that was all I would ever need. It's been a year now since the divorce was finalized. A year since the day I finally walked away from everything I had tried so hard to make work. A year since I gave myself permission to stop fighting for a future that wasn't meant for me. Looking back, I realized that I had spent too long trying to make someone else's vision of happiness fit my life. I had molded myself into what Laney wanted me to be, what his family expected, what society deemed as successful. But in doing so, I lost myself. Now every day feels like a slow but steady reclamation of who I am. Some days are still hard. I still wake up with a sense of unease that takes a few moments to shake off. I still have moments where I question if I made the right decision. But they're fewer now, and they don't last as long. I met Elena, the woman who came into my life after everything fell apart, not expecting much. But Elena, kind and understanding, offered me something I hadn't realized I was missing: stability. She didn't need me to fix her. She didn't need me to support her emotionally or financially. She wasn't looking for someone to make her feel whole. She was already whole. I'll never forget the day we sat in her living room, laughing over a cup of coffee, talking about our childhoods and our dreams. It was the first time I felt like I could breathe freely. No expectations, no masks, just me as I am. There's no rush with her. There's no pressure. We take things at our own pace, enjoying the moments we share, but never trying to push each other into a mold. It's real, and it's healthy. Sometimes I think about what I went through with Laney. I think about how much of my life was spent trying to fix something that wasn't broken in the first place, me. I spent years giving and expecting that love would be enough. But love isn't about sacrifice. It isn't about giving up who you are for someone else. Love is about respect, trust, and mutual growth. And when one person is constantly taking while the other gives, the relationship can only end in emptiness. The most important lesson I've learned is this: you are enough, and you don't owe anyone your happiness. I had spent so many years giving up pieces of myself, trying to fill a void that wasn't mine to fill. But now I understand something I couldn't have understood back then. True happiness comes from within. It doesn't come from someone else's approval or validation. It doesn't come from the love of a person who can't see your worth. It comes from knowing that you are enough, exactly as you are. I don't need anyone to complete me. I am whole on my own, and I'm finally at peace with that. I've started to share my story more openly, not to get sympathy, but to help others see that it's possible to heal. It's possible to find your way back to yourself, no matter how lost you may feel. There's no shame in rebuilding. There's no shame in walking away from something that isn't serving you. And above all, there's no shame in learning to love yourself, because that's the one thing no one can ever take from you. Now, as I look out over the life I've built, I realize it's not perfect, but it's mine, and that, to me, is everything. I'm not looking for perfection anymore. I'm looking for peace. I'm looking for growth. And I know that with each passing day, I'm moving closer to the person I was always meant to be. The real me,